Hello everyone, this is the fourth video for the lymphatic system and probably the next to last video. I think there'll be one more covering this chapter. As far as what we're going to cover in this chapter, we're going to start by talking about the secondary lymphatic structures. Secondary lymphatic structures are structures in the body that are housing immune system cells, and these are sites for immune surveillance and immune defense if a pathogen enters in the body. We're going to start by talking about the lymphatic organs. So these are structures that are discrete structures with a complete capsule. Okay, and those include the lymph nodes and the spleen. And probably the last video will cover the lymphatic tissues. These are unencapsulated structures, the tonsils, and the malt in the appendix. Okay. So, just to remind you, for the secondary lymphatic structures, some of the features, and we talked about this last time in the previous video. So they are housing mature immune system cells. And a characteristic feature of the, especially the secondary lymphatic organs, is they contain a mesh of fibers called the reticular connective tissue. This forms a matrix in the interior of these organs, and this matrix is used to support immune system cells, and they're involved in immune surveillance. Okay. Also, just to remind you, lymphatic organs have a capsule, and those are going to be the spleen and lymph nodes. The lymphatic tissues or nodules don't have a capsule. That's the malt in the tonsils. All right, so let's start with the lymph nodes. Just some general information about lymph nodes. So lymph nodes are the most abundant lymphatic organs in the body. They're scattered throughout the body, and just because of their abundance and number, they are the primary or principal type of lymphoid organ that we contain. The lymph nodes are have a connective tissue capsule, so they're encapsulated, and the immune system cells are contained within that capsule. Lymph nodes occur along the pathways of the lymphatic collecting vessels, and those vessels are going to feed lymph into the interior of the lymph node, and it's going to exit also. All right, so it's lymph is passing through these lymph nodes. Lymph nodes can be scattered, throughout the body in deep or superficial tissue, but many nodes are organized into three main clusters in the body. So those clusters are shown here in the neck, cervical, armpit, axillary, and in the groin or the inguinal clusters. Lymph nodes carry out two main functions. We've talked a lot about this function, immune surveillance and defense, and that's because they're packed with mature immune system cells. But I haven't mentioned this function very much. They also serve as physical filters of the lymph. Remember, lymph, anything pretty much can get into the lymphatic vessels and the lymphatic capillaries. So this might have a lot of particles if there's debris in the tissues, let's say due to some kind of injury to the tissue. So it's a physical filter also of the lymph. A little bit about the distribution. So I mentioned that there are three main clusters, axillary, inguinal, and cervical clusters, and many of the lymph nodes are found there. Also, there are, kind of lone scattered lymph nodes other places in the body. Altogether, you have 500 to 700 total lymph nodes in the body. All right, I prepared a short video about the general structure of a lymph node. So there's a little bit of terminology involved here. So this video will show those general features, and then we'll come back and go through those also. Hello, so I made a drawing of a lymph node just to illustrate the basic structure of the lymph node. There's a lot of terminology involved, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time going through that. So here is a lymph node, general shape of a lymph node. It can vary a little bit, spherical or oval shaped, or even this kind of kidney bean type shape. This is a typical type of representation you'll see in the textbook. So one thing to notice it's connected to a lot of lymphatic collecting vessels, and most of these are bringing lymph in. So they're color-coded red on this diagram. Those are the afferent vessels. Lots of afferent vessels bringing lymph in to the lymph node, okay? And then on the indented side, this is called the hilum. There's typically one, maybe two vessels bringing lymph out, okay? So lymph is going to come in. It's going to circulate through the interior of the lymph node. It's going to find its way to the exit point and go out through the efferent vessel. This might go to a lymphatic trunk, or it might go into another lymph node. Some pathways have multiple lymph nodes along the way. As far as the internal anatomy, the two main structures or areas are the cortex. Cortex is the outer stripe along the outside edge of most of the lymph node, cortex. And then the middle part is the medulla. So the medulla has a different kind of anatomy. The internal structure differs, but the medulla is going to be nearby to the efferent vessel. Okay, so lymph is going to enter, it's going to travel through the cortex, it's going to make its way to the medulla, and then exit out the efferent vessel. All right, some other terminology. So within the cortex, a lymph node is an encapsulated structure. Here's the capsule running along the outside. Capsule is a fibrous connective tissue, lots of collagen fibers in it. It protects it, but also some of those fibers penetrate inward. And so those form structures, I didn't label them on this, those are called the trabeculae. Trabeculae. Trabeculae are basically these are partitions that are going to sector off the cortex of the lymph node, right? So now there are little rooms or chambers in the cortex, okay? And that's a repeating feature of the cortex. What you have occupying these chambers are lymphatic nodules. Nodules are groups of immune system cells. Okay, the nodules can be further subdivided into different areas. So I've color-coded them here. The central blue area is called the germinal center. The germinal center in the middle of the lymphatic nodule. This is rich in B cells. Surrounding that is called the mantle zone, color-coded in green on this. Mantle zone surrounding the germinal center. So it's kind of a bullseye type appearance. The mantle zone has a lot of T cells and also a lot of macrophages. And then surrounding that, and I've just shown it with red arrows here, that's called the cortical sinus. The cortical sinus is where the lymph is going to flow in through an afferent vessel and through these sinuses. And as it flows, it's going to be exposed to cells in the mantle zone and the germinal center. So it's somewhat filtering through. The cortical sinus has reticular connective tissue, lots of fibers in the pathway of this lymph flowing through it. And sitting on those fibers, kind of perched on them, like a bird on a tree limb, are cells of the immune system. They're going to be exposed to whatever's flowing by in the lymph. Okay? So that's a basic structure of a lymphatic nodule, which is a repeating structure in the chambers of the cortex. The chambers are sectored off by the trabeculae. All right, how about the medulla? The medulla has a very kind of disorganized appearance to it, not as regular as the cortex. But there are two main structures that are involved. There are what are called the medullary cords, and these are sort of islands or areas where there are fibers running through the medulla, okay? So you can think of them as sort of barriers within the medulla. And the other main part shown by red arrows here are passageways for lymph to flow through. So these are called the medullary sinuses. Cortical sinuses, pathways in the cortex. Medullary sinuses are pathways in the medulla. And the medullary sinuses are also composed of reticular connective tissue. Okay? So because of this structure, there's a non-direct pathway, let's put it that way, between where lymph enters in an afferent vessel and where it exits in an efferent. It has this kind of contorted pathway to get around the nodule in the cortex and then to get around the medullary cords in the medulla till it can eventually exit. That's a good thing. That's going to slow down circulation of lymph. It's going to expose it to immune system cells. The more contorted the pathway, the more time material spends in the lymph node and the more opportunity to be exposed to some kind of immune system cell. All right, well, that's the general anatomy of a lymph node. All right, so just to review terminology that was in that video, lymph nodes, general shape, they vary somewhat from round to oval to kind of bean-shaped. They have a large number of vessels bringing lymph in. Those are called the afferent vessels. And they have a few, usually one or maybe two vessels draining lymph out from if it's a bean-shaped lymph node, from the hilum, the indented side of the node. Those are called the efferent vessel or vessels. The node is enclosed by a capsule, which is a collagen fibrous connective tissue, dense, irregular connective tissue. And fibers from the capsule penetrate inward and sector off the cortex. Those partitions or walls are called the trabeculae, and the spaces enclosed by the trabeculae contain lymphatic nodules. If you look at the cortex, the nodules have three main areas. The germinal center is kind of the bullseye of the target. Center of it, that's rich with B cells. Surrounding that is a stripe called the mantle zone, and that has a lot of T cells and macrophages. And then surrounding that is the cortical sinus. This is a passageway for lymph to flow around the lymphatic nodules in the cortex. In the medulla of the lymph node, there are medullary cords, and these are dense arrays of fibers. And sitting on these fibers, I didn't mention it in the video, but there are immune system cells, B and T cells, and macrophages perched on those fibers. And then the medullary sinus passageways through the medulla, eventually to the efferent vessel. And this is a figure from the textbook showing basically what I drew on the lymphatic nodules with the germinal center in the middle, mantle zone surrounding that, and the sinuses, the passageway. So lymph is going to come in, pass into these sinuses, it's going to interact with the cells in the nodule, and it's going to get into the medullary sinuses. And remember, there are more cells, immune system cells on these medullary cords, and then it's eventually going to make it to the efferent vessel. Right, and this slide is just showing, looking at the cortex. Here is a lymphatic nodule here. So germinal center, mantle zone, and the sinus surrounding that. And this is what the medulla would look like with medullary cords. Doesn't really show the fibers, shows the immune system cells, and the medullary sinus for lymph to flow. And this is actual tissue section, histology of a lymphatic nodule. So you can see the nodule here, and you can see the different coloration. Germinal center is a little bit lighter than the mantle zone, and the sinus surrounding that. All right, this slide is a really good illustration of the reticular connective tissue. Reticular connective tissue is made up of reticular fibers They're loosely arranged into a mesh. The reticular fibers are branched, so they can form this kind of mesh. And there's a lot of space. That's kind of the dark areas here. This is what lymph is flowing through in both the cortical sinus and the medullary sinus. And the lymph, as it flows through, is going to be evaluated by these immune system cells perched on these fibers. So that's the immune surveillance that's going on in both the cortical and the medullary sinus. All right, just a word about how lymph flows through the lymph nodes. So keep in mind that there are many more afferent vessels than there are efferent. So this sort of causes a logjam of lymph inside the lymph node. It takes a while for lymph to flow out. It has to meander through. That's one thing. It can't just go straight from entry to exit. And so this allows lymph and whatever it contains to be evaluated really well by the immune system cells that are inside of the lymph node. Okay? If there are any particulates, the macrophages will take care of those, so they will engulf them. They'll be phagocytic cells, and they will break them down. So it's both carrying out both immune surveillance and physical filtration of the lymph. And just a brief word about immune surveillance. If a lymphocyte, B or T cell, encounters a foreign substance, let's say a bacterium in the lymph, that will trigger an immune response against that bacterium and any others similar to it. And that immune response involves activation of the lymphocytes, in which they undergo proliferation, meaning they divide rapidly. So starting out with just a few lymphocytes is going to produce a huge number, an army of lymphocytes, in order to do battle against this pathogen. So what happens typically in a lymph node where it's exposed to a pathogen is the accumulation of cells causes the lymph node to swell. And the swelling makes them, can make them kind of tender. So you may have had a sore throat or some kind of head cold. And one of the ways to check for that is to check for the size of the lymph nodes in your cervical region, in the neck. Swelling of the cervical lymph nodes is an indication you have some kind of infection of the throat or, of the head, because those structures drain to the cervical lymph nodes. Okay, so swelling of lymph nodes is indicating you're fighting something off. All right, I think I'm going to end this video here. In the last video, I'll cover the other secondary lymphatic structures. See ya.